It is a great pleasure, privilege, and joy for me to be here and address this forum and this august group of Swedish-Greek trade doers. I represent now the National Board of Trade. And the National Board of Trade is Sweden's agency, Sweden's government's agency for international trade, EU internal market, and trade policy. We have been around since 1651. I do not intend to go that long back in history, but I think in order to reflect on where we are today in the global system, as Vasilis mentioned, and the challenges we have in the global system, it is worthwhile to look back a little bit at least. The kind of globalization that we were used to for a couple of decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, is no more. That is evident. And in a way, that is not a good thing. Globalization has lifted millions of people out from poverty around the globe in a very positive way throughout these decades. Now, probably, when we look back in economic history, we will find that the kind of globalization we saw from the 1990s and onwards probably has been and is a parenthesis in history. We see again today that security policy is more and more inflicting on, if I may say so, or putting its traces on other types of policies, including trade policy. I think it might be worthwhile reflecting on the fact that that is nothing new. After the Second World War, the United States built the global trading system with allies in making sure that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that Greece acceded to in 1950 and Sweden in 1951, became a club of countries integrated, trading together in a way that led to prosperity and in a way that made the Soviet bloc kept behind. You could argue that the success of the global trading system as built by the Americans after the Second World War was part of the explanation for why the Soviet bloc imploded and why we got the end of the Cold War. At that time, the heydays of globalization, we also saw the most far-reaching global trading negotiation ever taking place. The GATT round that was alluded to earlier, where I started my career, so I'm an old-timer in this respect. But again, tremendous results were created in that negotiation. Vast liberalization of industrial products. Agricultural trade was for the first time put under global trading rules and liberalized. Same for textiles, which was important for many countries. New rules for services, intellectual property rights, investments, and a binding dispute settlement system. All this was set up during the heydays of globalization when the World Trade Organization came about in 1995. Today, as you know, the WTO has 164 members. Decisions are taken by consensus in that organization, and that explains partly why it is no longer very efficient. But these these grand days of globalization didn't last for long. There were protests against what was done in the World Trade Organization. Some of you might recall the havoc in Genoa at the G7 meeting, WTO meeting in Seattle, riots on the streets, an EU meeting in Gothenburg, riots on the streets. So there were plenty of views against the kind of globalization that was created. But again, security-related facts intervened. After 9/11, the atrocities of 9/11, the global community again thought it would try again to push the global system forward, and we got the Doha round of trade negotiations going. It went on for a while, collapsed in 2008. And that, I would argue, is the end point of globalization as it used to be in the old past days. Since then, the global trading system has basically not evolved. Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history during this period. Of course, history wasn't dead, and we have seen that in many ways in recent time, as we have heard. So, the start of the fragmentation of the global trading system. Jagdish Bhagwati, the American economist, said that this was a spaghetti bowl of trade agreement around the world. And if one looks at that picture, one sees why that was the case. So that has been the avenue forward since then. Bilateral, regional negotiations. The US participated at first. The EU has been good in forging such agreements and arrangements, and that's positive. And with the Great Recession that broke out 2008, with the severe times, not least for Europe and Greece, there was an attempt, as you know, to clinch a global bilateral trade deal between the EU and the United States that failed and was abolished under the Trump years in the United States. Evident that the global changes in the structure of power is behind this. You see China's rise, if you measure power in terms of share of world exports. The United States going down, the EU flat, and this, of course, we know in global system leads to conflict and difficulties. And that is, I think, what we have been seeing lately. We have heard a lot already about the pandemic and what it meant for difficulties for traders as you. I would also say that despite problems at the beginning of the pandemic, we also saw that EU rules, global rules, actually saved us during the pandemic. It was thanks to a still fairly robust global trading system that both protective gear and not least the vaccine could be produced and distributed. So positive aspects from trade in that respect as well. The war in Ukraine and now the horrific conflict in the Middle East, of course, has affected the system very much as well. Interesting, I think, to note is that Russia exceeded the WTO in 2012 without much change being made to that country. And we also know, of course, what happened from 2014 and onwards and what the atrocities in Ukraine have meant for the global trading system. But it has also forged the Western alliance, and I think that is good. We've heard about Sweden's and Finland's NATO accession, and hopefully soon Swedish NATO accession. It is, in my view, a negative that this new era of transatlantic unity has not spilled over to trade yet, because we see that the United States is no longer a champion of free trade, and there are many reasons for that that I don't need to go into. But the United States is no longer seeking free trade solutions, neither in the WTO nor bilaterally. Instead, the main objective of the United States is to keep China at bay through various means. And China, of course, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty thanks to China's integration in the trading system since 2001, when China was given accession to the World Trade Organization. But it's also equally evident that China is not a country that fits under the global trading rules, given its state capitalism and the Communist Party's way of looking at how trade and production should be done. So clear challenges there, in particular for our European Union, which now has to try to find out how to handle this situation, this new landscape. Evidently, and that's important, there are important American examples to follow, not least when it comes to how to handle the real security-related problems with China and the real trade distortive aspects of Chinese behavior around the globe. And we are doing that. The Commission is now about to set up a new economic security strategy, which will include more action on both inward and outward investment screening, and also attempts to have a more unified European export control system. This is all important, but equally important for resilience and for the future is that the EU continues to push for free trade agreements with allies and with trusted partners. And I would argue that it's equally important that despite difficulties in the WTO, the EU needs also to push for and promote the WTO as a framework for global trade, also in these difficult times. That's important for trading countries like Greece and Sweden and the EU, but also, and not least, for a number of developing countries around the world. The future ain't what it used to be, that's for sure. I don't know how many of you who know the American late baseball player Yogi Berra, who is said to have said this once. And it is a new trade landscape that we are now seeing. New instruments are being set up in terms of how to cooperate on trade. We have the Trade and Technology Council with the United States. That's important, but it has so far not given any trace of new trade openings. We are trying with the Americans to make sure that we don't have to reinstate the tariffs on steel and aluminum, and that's difficult. And the EU has to continue to push in these directions. And the question, of course, is to what extent we will see a future where the EU pursues strategic autonomy, or whether we are able to pursue open strategic economy, which of course is the solution we want to see from the Swedish, and I learned today also, happily so, from a Greek point of view. I will finish by saying that much has changed. There are also things that haven't changed. The need to make sure that we reap the benefits from trade, and we know that open trade delivers welfare to our countries if correctly handled. We know that economic integration still works, even if we can't pursue integration with countries like China and Russia anymore. We know that Ricardo's theory of comparative advantages still functions, and modern trade theory has shown that the gains from trade are probably larger than we thought before, given that openness for trade makes firms more productive than otherwise. And that is a key finding of recent economic research. If you're interested in this, you see here a link to a publication that the National Board of Trade has published, and that you are welcome to find on our web page. How is this happening? A key factor is imports. And we often forget that, of course, politicians like to see exports flourishing. It's equally important to have a functioning import regime for the EU, for our countries. And it's through such a thing that we can do better when it comes to also become good exporters. We see how imports make companies more productive, trade, foreign direct investment make those companies more productive, and we have better access to intermediary goods and what have you. So many factors of this sort are important. And of course, also increased access to other markets makes our countries' economies more productive and competitive. There are a number of examples that can be referred to. If one looks at Swedish firms that trade, generally speaking, they have 48% higher labor productivity and pay 44% higher wages than firms that do not engage in trade and have international links of that sort. There are many challenges ahead, not least when it comes to figuring out with whom to forge new and more open trade conditions. We have to be careful not to enter into difficulties with our security. That's key in relation to countries like Russia and China. But all in all, many possible opportunities still ahead, including for Swedish and Greek traders. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Impressed with the sharpness on time. Not surprising, given the Swedish nationality. And also very excited about the positive tone around the fact that the chronicles on the death of globalization are grossly exaggerated, the renewed focus on free trade agreements and the support for the World Trade Organization. The new vocabulary, securitization, has entered the global lingo in a new context around security rather than the financial markets and strategic autonomy, and also the positive note on importance of trade and the importance of imports as much as exports.